Hello, everyone. I just want to introduce the panel, and then we could begin. I just remind all the speakers that each speaker has a grand total of 30 minutes to speak. Our first speaker is Gabriel Costello from mighty Ireland, and he is from the technology, the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology in Ireland. And his the title of his talk today is Edith Stein and the Agenda for the Third Millennium. So Gabriel, welcome, and please go ahead.
Gabriel, thank you very much, Antonio, and everybody. I'm delighted and privileged to be part of this this conference, and I thank you for your invitation. And as I say, I teach in an engineering school in industrial and mechanical engineering, so you might make allowances for me when you through the presentation. So I just talk about the little journey that I'm maybe on in the last number of years. What I'll talk today about maybe my motivation for why I think Edith Stein has so much to offer in the third millennium in these times. Something about where I am. I've spent 20 years in industry, 20 years teaching, nearly coming to the end of that, but I'm very much new to the area of phenomenology. So I talk about some current themes in management and technology that I have come across in the last number of years and that I've been interested in. And I see them as opportunities for exploration in the work of Edith Stein, and of course raising awareness of this wonderful, wonderful person, wonderful woman. My point would be, I think they're ripe for contributing to the agenda for the third millennium. I know maybe some people from Brazil here, but there's a place near the west coast of Ireland called High Brazil, which I might show you at the end if you're still with me. So what was my motivation in that? Well, I think on page 4 of Alistair MacIntyre's book on Edith Stein, he talks about philosophy being imprisoned in academia. And I suppose I, a little bit naive, wanted to bring her out into another world where management, engineering, and see what she has to say. So that was a motivation. Where I am, I said, I'm just down there on the left-hand side in my engineering suit, part of the, hopefully trying to become part of Edith Stein's kindergarten, and remembering what she said famously in Freiburg when somebody asked her, was she starting a seminar on philosophy? She said, no, I'm running a philosophical kindergarten. So I'm trying to gain entry into that little kindergarten, and I need some help. I'm looking for ideas from people, some things I'd like to work on, and it's very much in that spirit that I would like to be part of this conference. So I'm just going to give some personal thoughts on challenges and indeed, I think, potentialities for Edith Stein in the life world as we go into the new millennium. And so that's some thoughts. So the first area that I like to talk about is a lot of my work is in the area of design and innovation and my teaching. And this is a movement that started in engineering 40 years ago in the Stanford D School, has grown to right outside of engineering into medicine and various other places. And design thinking is quite a large movement now. And if you look at the first step on it is empathize. And again, that struck me as, this is Edith Stein's world, she must be able to offer. And so empathy is the first and the most important step in design thinking, which I believe is becoming more and more influential in the area of design and innovation. And it's Marianne Sawicki talks about in the introduction to philosophy, psychology, and humanities that the treatise propose a theory of human creative achievement. And she talks about the importance of imagination, empathy for imagination. So again, this is an area which I'm trying to explore, and I think is ripe for. Also in Harvard, Dorothy Leonard for a number of years has been talking about empathic design and the importance of empathy in the whole design process. When I looked at this first, I thought it might be science fiction, but there is actually a serious movement in even academia about the whole area of transhumanism. A recent book by Ross talks about, it's an international movement now which anticipates human developing and post-human capacities in the near future, and it raises many ethical and philosophical issues. A very recent book, recently a Transhumanist Reader, which is a chapter on the philosophy of transhumanism, say that it basically that thinking, feeling selves are physical processes. And it also interestingly says that chapter talks about transhumanism fulfilling the same function as a religion. A little bit of work something I'm working on paper at the moment looks at life power, and my point there is that the transhumanist movement has very much one layer, a physical process that is the human person. While if you look at Edith Stein's philosophy it talks about the four phenomenal divisions. Thanks again to Marianne Sawecki, and that the realms of the phenomenal realms and the layers of human being are much more complex than transhumanism. And so I'm working on that, looking at life power, and I got a present from Edith Stein yesterday that a book on Edith Stein has a lot of by Sarah Borden, which has a lot of information on life power. I'm looking forward to reading it. Related to this whole area of super intelligence and transhumanism is the area of artificial intelligence. And Terence Chesnowski has been very influential in that whole movement, but in his book on Deep Learning Revolution, he talks about, just a quotation on page 258, that emotions and empathy are often ignored in artificial intelligence, and they're also essential aspects of intelligence. So there's a lot of work going on in this whole area of artificial intelligence, and I would bring to people's attention that it needs to be divided into what people say is narrow artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. Narrow AI is what maybe we're looking at, and we use a Google search, but artificial general intelligence is trying to actually mimic human intelligence with all the philosophical and ethical questions that raises. So again, we have the empathy and emotions, which is very much Edith Stein's area, which I think can provide very important, thoughtful input into this debate. In reading some of Edith Stein's work, I'm very struck by this empathy as a two-way process. Some people talk about putting into other people's shoes, but empathy is important to understanding our own nature as well as that of others. So in the area of human development, I think that is a very important part that maybe needs a little bit more attention in the general area and the general work on when people talk about empathy. It's a much wider concept than sometimes it's attributed to in the general literature. On the bottom there, I talk about avatars, some of the things I'm concerned about that we need to be concerned about when talking about empathy. Avatars, the Wizard of Oz, and the manipulation of empathy. Who is behind the digital screen is a very important thing, because the person who is behind the wizard has a lot of influence on people especially those who are vulnerable. And so avatars can become very empathetic, but we have to be very careful that who is behind the screen and what ethical and worldview that they have transmitting. So that's the work I'm looking at the moment. I'm started putting together is in the Routledge International Handbook of Psychoanalysis, Subjectivity and Technology. So I didn't know anything about psychoanalysis until I started reading some over the summer. And Rudolf Allers is somebody who comes up in Edith Stein's literature. I was struck by it, and his book on psychoanalysis is a fairly solid undermining of Freud from a philosophical point of view, and maybe has. But I think if you look at on the problem with the introduction, again, I'm very in debt to the people who have put the introductions to Edith Stein's works and make them accessible to somebody like me. But Walrath Stein and Marianne Sawicki again talks about pursuing dialogue with Freud, and I think this relationship with Rudolf Allers, I know some people would say that Edith Stein wasn't aware of the debates in psychoanalysis, but when you look that she used to stay in that Rudolf Allers house, he was right in there at the very beginnings of psychoanalysis. And I can't imagine that the discussions in the evening in Allers' household wasn't about what was happening in the latest in psychoanalysis. Again, this life power is something that I think is a great discussion point, and to pursue dialogue with psychoanalysis, given its antipathy to things like religion, and so that's just maybe in the west of Ireland we might think this is a hot potato, and I don't want to. I know a lot of people have done a lot of study on this, but I'm struck as a person in the present world on the whole area of gender theory, and we must be, of course, we're respectful for that. But Edith Stein has her work on woman is seminal, very, very important. And she does talk about the masculine and feminine species, and the thing about a feminine soul and a masculine soul. And probably one of the problems we have now is people don't believe in a soul anymore. So, but maybe the work of somebody like Edith Stein, this wonderful feminist, can actually bracket people's prejudices and talk about things like this. In another area that I've come across is historical supersessionism, and supersessionism is replacement. It comes from a theology standpoint, sometimes called replacement theology, and it's probably a bit poignant in the case of Edith Stein's Jewish background that the supersessionist view was that the new covenant replaces the old, but it's very nice to see lovely documents coming from the Vatican now saying that the gift and the call of God has not been revoked. This Brad Gregory, the historian, takes this up is in the idea that the Enlightenment and it has very much assumed that the distant past is left behind. It has nothing to offer. And in it, it's a very well referenced work. And he does mention Edith Stein as challenging the confessionally secularist agenda that proposed ours is a secular age. That may be the mantra, but he points out that great thinkers like Edith Stein were not secular. And even in Finite and Eternal Being, Edith Stein says the great thinkers of the Christian Middle Ages wrestled with the same problems that concern us today, and it does therefore much to tell us that may prove of great help in our present situation. So again, I think it's up to us to say that the past is important. I didn't think I'd be quoting Marx, but I thought this way. But in terms of supersessionism, he did prophesy that both philosophy and religion will become obsolete. I think in the present days we can say Marxism hasn't gone away, but I would agree with him when he says we're not able to shed our history the way a snake sheds its skin. In the own field that I've been working on, this is another supersessionist idea, I think, coming from Kant and the influence of positivism in the social sciences. And again, that religious and metaphysical thought has been superseded by the new scientific thought, even though Kant had his own religion of humanity with its own saints and like Frederick the Great. Edith Stein put her finger on this very much on the problem of empathy, the mechanical causation as an explanation of physical phenomena is not appropriate for explaining spiritual phenomena, and that word Geist is probably not translated too well in the English connotations of spiritual, as Walter Stein points out. Is this important? I say it is. Again, this is a paper from 2003 that I just did a little analysis of. It was looking at the dominant or the underlying philosophies in management information systems, and that's an area that I did some work in. And the overwhelming philosophical underpinning was positivism. So it's alive and very much well, but Ron Weber, not Max Weber, was an editor of MIS Quarterly around a number of years ago, was concerned about researchers not really having ontological, epistemological assumptions and being true to their philosophical positions. So it seemed that positive was maybe more convention than conviction, but it is very it is a very dominant in the social sciences, and I think it's something we need to collectively say and challenge. This is taken from Responsible Research and Innovation done, and Brené von Schomburg is a member of the European Commission and also an academic, but he talks about this area of responsible research and innovation and how he talks about he gives a definition of it, and the words that come out there is a mutual responsive to each other, societal actors, and this idea that Edith Stein has as the life power of communities, which is wonderful. So I think it can actually influence that debate, and finally, the dialogue or the lack of dialogue between philosophy, science, and religion, which I think is something that is something that hopefully the 21st century will see. But why is Edith Stein well placed in that? Well, she did study theoretical physics in Göttingen. She uses light, power, and electricity as a metaphor in philosophy of psychology, and that was really around the time of when this whole area of electricity and was and the theoretical work. And I thought it very interesting that her request to Hedwig Conrad Martius for the latest literature on atomic theory during the period when she was finishing Finite and Eternal Being in the Carmel of Cologne. Again, the 1930s, the year of the Bohr-Einstein debates. Edith Stein was keeping up with what was going on in debates. I think this is, and maybe the whole area of bracketing, if we can take it to, can to reclaim prejudice, as Gadamer says. Can we and the science and religion, rather than the Weberian view, the science versus religion. Finally, a clarion call from Alistair MacIntyre, I think, in After Virtue. So, time for resisting as prudently and courageously and justly and temperately as possible the dominant social, economic, and political order of advanced modernity. I've been just throwing some ideas there of what are some of the dominant areas that maybe we need to collectively resist and say there is another way where Edith Stein can lead us. So in summary, I believe that Edith Stein can set a wide-ranging agenda, way beyond the normal, what we call philosophical agenda for the third millennium. She can address what the future we want from science and innovation and the values. Can address the philosophical crisis in the social sciences, which and maybe to quote Pope Francis, we can bring Edith Stein to the peripheries. Alistair MacIntyre says the lives of philosophers are of philosophical interest, and the wonderful life of Edith Stein is, I think, the most interesting one. And what are we, if we can make her a little bit more widely renowned and honoured throughout the whole world and throughout many disciplines. I said I'd show you where High Brazil, not High Brazil. This is 30 kilometers from where I'm sitting, an island off the coast of Galway. And High Brazil is a place that you can see sometimes in looking out over Dunangus. Some people say it doesn't exist like Atlantis, but I found a medieval map of Europe, and High Brazil is showing on it. So I hope I didn't go over time. I was
that was Gabriel. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. So we have a couple of minutes for questions or comments. If you'd like to place them in the question and answer key, that would be great. We have time. Jimena reminds us that we're going to use the Q&A function to deal with questions. Thank you, Jimena.
Just in the question about atomic theory, here I'd say the book, I got that in the chronology section of Life in a Jewish Family, and it was just a passing reference to. Didn't say what literature but again, Richard Courant, the mathematician, that she was very au fait with all that was happening in science and math and at the time.
So we also have a question from Meta Lebeck. She asks about Stein and management theory. How do you see the potential? Thanks, Meta.
Again, Meta. If you look at things that are hot topics on empathy now is a very hot topic in the empathetic management and etc. And I think there's lots of areas that it's in particular that that emphasis or interest in management theory, and as I say, the underlying philosophy of a lot of the management schools is positivism, and which again, the treatment of people like as physical objects, if you look at the underneath of philosophy. So I think people are looking and looking, managers, but also people looking for aptitudes in their managers that are more humanistic and empathetic. I hope that's.
Thanks, Gib. We also have a question from Anna Maria Pezzella, and she asks, emotions are a kind of intelligence. What do you think?
Yeah, there's the emotional intelligence is an interesting debate. How you can read a person emotionally is, I would agree that it is a gift that you can develop and learn, and I do think, yes, it's if you look at that the emotions are how you read this life power. I think is a wonderfully is a wonderful concept from Edith Stein, and again how you can read people through and how they can read you is yeah, I would agree.
Thank you. And we have a question from Maria Pringle, and she asks, from philosophical, psychological, ethical, and religious perspectives, do you find a parallel between Romans from the first century and our time? Today's reading is from Paul to the Romans, so 1625.
Okay, so I should remember that. Could you clarify that maybe in just the point from Romans that I might address? I
don't have any information from Maria at this point, but we can go to one last question in the meantime from Joyce Berkman, and she asks, to what extent do those in management consider Stein's warning about projection of one's own feelings and thoughts mistakenly as the other person's thoughts and feelings?
Yeah, well, my concern is people don't know Edith Stein, and I think I think the possibilities there are there's wonderful possibilities for bringing Edith Stein's work or thought into things like management, and that's really one of the points I'm trying to make is and that and like that point is there's lots of relevant aspects that Edith Stein can bring to the debate and to the formation. I think the education of managers is another thing that's very important, and the Enlightenment view of education of transmitting knowledge. And Alistair McIntyre talks about the managerial mindset. I think it's ripe for a more human aspect, and I think Edith Stein can offer a lot to that debate.
So thanks very much, Gabriel. Thanks very much to the audience members who posted a question. What was really fascinating is the application of Stein into these very contemporary areas, and that was wonderful. So thanks very much. I think if you could stop the sharing, Gabriel. Great, thank you. We could move to our next speaker, who is Paul O'Hagan from Ireland.
Hi, Antonio.
Hi, Paul. Okay? Yes, and you're going to continue to extend the legacy of Stein by bringing her into dialogue with Theodor Adorno, which is great. And the title of your talk today is Stein, Adorno, and the Social Constitution of Identity. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I suppose I just better go for this, and then I can take questions and stuff at the end. So we'll just share and just go for it. So getting this okay, and there should be some sounds as well.
Paul, I don't think there's any sound coming through.
Oh, sorry, hold on. Right, I'm sorry that you missed the beginning of that. It was actually set up for a track by Pink Floyd, which actually took us through. The lyrics are very, very evocative and takes us through this idea of socially constituted identity, which is the idea of us and them, which is key to the work of both Edith Stein and, believe it or not, Theodore Adorno, who share a lot of philosophical ground on this area. Just to get us in quickly, this relationship between Stein and Adorno is something that I've been exploring. This particular presentation is a revised version of a presentation I gave a few months back to the International Association of Women Philosophers. Thanks to the support of Meta Lebec, I've been exploring this area between Stein and Adorno, and you can see actually here on this particular slide that Adorno's interest in phenomenology is profound. It carries all the way through his work. My background is really as an Adorno scholar rather than a Stein scholar. But once I was introduced to Stein, it became very, very clear to me that there were a lot of shared interests and also profound interest in phenomenology as a methodology and as an approach, both with the criticisms of phenomenology. I think when we're looking at the issues here around a socially constituted identity, there are two particular works out of this sort of list that I really want to just look at and sort of dismiss as something that I'm not going to get into in real detail. One is Stein's Life in the Jewish Family. I think that it would be the obvious one to go for in terms of her autobiographical detail, but I do feel that as a mediated text, it is highly problematic. I think the apologia and the preface that leads us into it and the context for her writing it are all something that is up for discussion. The same is true of Horkheimer and Adorno's text on anti-Semitism that is within the context of the dialectic of enlightenment. There are strong contextual premises for putting this work together, and also there's a form of signaling that is going on that is not always evident to readers who are coming at it for the first time. There are lots of symbolic references, and certainly in terms of Stein's work in particular, I don't think that, well, no biography or autobiography could be read as just a sort of de facto text of anybody's life. But in Stein's terms, I think that it's very, very clear that there is an agenda where she is interacting with a resistance literature that is going on at the time, particularly like in Germany and in Munich. And I think Sawicki herself sort of like nods in that direction. So I think that those two texts, are two texts that bear a lot of study. And although I could do a lot of work on that, I want to leave them to one side at this point. But for this point, just to be clear that there's a lot of, I'm looking at phenomenology and I'm looking at the way in which Adorno has critiqued phenomenology and also the way in which Stein has critiqued phenomenology as well. Some key concepts to Stein, as we can see, for those that know Stein and probably know her much better than me, we've got some key concepts here that are to do with the empathetic relation with the other, the continuous constitution of the self. This idea that as individuals, we don't shape our own identity. What we do is we we constitute our identity through connections with other people, and that can be socially constituted. That means that it is only in the interaction, the empathetic interaction with others, that we actually become ourselves. And this relational idea is very, very important, and it gives Stein a premise that actually is the premise that contradicts Husserl, which Adorno then picks up on. Now, Adorno never references Stein ever. He never says that he's contacted her work. It never comes up that he's even been informed of her work. However, he is on the same area of contradiction in terms of Husserl. He wrote his doctoral thesis on Husserl. He's very aware of what is going on, even in terms of the realist-idealist divide that's happening there. Unfortunately, he does tend to dismiss a lot of Husserl's followers as his disciples or his acolytes, but Adorno is very, very clear that it's the individualistic aspect of Husserl that is problematic, and the constitution of identity, which actually both Stein and Adorno pick up on as being a problematic aspect in Husserl, and they approach it much more in a sense of the individual as related to community, as related to a collective identity, as related to society, that there is something beyond our state of self-definition, and it is the beyond that self-definition that actually makes us who we are. As you can see, Adorno approaches this from a completely different direction, which he terms the negative dialectic. It's coming straight out of his interpretation of Hegel, and an application of a dialectical response to identity. So if there's a sense of being, there's also a sense of non-being. And for those of you that know Stein's work will know that Stein also, even in her mature work, talks about this sense of being and non-being. And Adorno's right in there with her. This becomes like fundamental to his mature work, which is negative dialectics. The assertion of an identity must always be accompanied by an assertion of a non-identity. A not you has to be there. And this not you, this orientation towards society, towards life, towards a system that we live in, that orientation about who we are cannot be defined by ourselves. It must be defined within a context. And it's also fluid. It's not just a static thing as well. Now, the difference between Stein and Adorno, and it's a marked difference in terms of approaching these concepts, is that Stein is very much coming from a phenomenological perspective that is involved with a negotiation and a conversation with theology. Now, that's not to say Adorno is not, but it is tempered with Marxism. And Adorno's Marxism is a Hegelian Marxism, so it's not a determinative Marxism. It's a type of engagement with society. So Marx is seen as a critique of capitalism, and the capitalism that exists for Adorno is a defining capitalism. It defines you as a commodity. It defines you as a customer. It defines you in your role in society. And for Adorno, this is deeply problematic, and there must be more to us than that. And so the Marxist dialectic reveals that to us, but it is the phenomenological move that moves us philosophically to the point where we can actually do something about it. And for me, Adorno doesn't have a clear concept of how society is made up. He never posits it that way. He's always involved in the philosophical conceptual element of it. He doesn't take on board what became termed as the vulgar Marxist rudiments of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He rails against this, and as a result, he's been heavily criticized for not having this kind of solidity in the middle of his philosophy. And I'm positing that actually Stein has that. Stein has looked at the individual, the society, the community, associations in ways that are different from Marx, but actually in a lot of ways are coming to a similar place, particularly like if you look at Marx from a Hegelian perspective. Behind both of these thinkers are two other very, very important philosophers. And I can't, overestimate their significance really. And both of their work was accessed by both Stein and by Adorno, respectively, at early stages. So Walter Benjamin's connected with Adorno, and this early work that he was doing on the concept of history, his ideas of non-linear qualitative time, the messianic moment, which is the revelatory moment where you become aware that there is a system that is trying to identify you, trying to define you, and the redemption that you get from acting on that awareness. This is all early work by Benjamin. It was actually never really published, and it was published through Adorno later on after his death. Konrad Martius is another one who went on to publish very, very, very interesting, complex, and profound notions of the idea of space and time, giving us the premise that there could be other dimensions, other actualities, ways of participating, that there wasn't just a single progressive idea of history or time. And certainly like that feeds directly into some of Stein's concepts when we're talking about the idea of becoming, the idea of being, the idea of realizing the self. There are these moments of time where we can become other things. We can become other than what we think that we are, and we can be changed by circumstances. Now, these concepts underpin both, respectively, Benjamin underpins Adorno, and Konrad Martius underpins a lot of what Stein's involved with as well. And we have to see that these people are part of a collective, themselves a socially constituted unit. The ideas of phenomenology are up for grabs in a way that some of the larger philosophical movements have not been. And in itself, this movement, this sense of being able to change the philosophical direction, being able to impact something, is a very, very important idea. The fact that you can actually engage in philosophical debate and come to conclusions that are breaking open some of the systems. And that is as true for Adorno with Marxism, which he found constrictive and a restraint, and as well for Stein, who found that that some of the doctrines and dogmas that were coming out, particularly whenever Husserl was trying to rework his system as a system, that became a problem for her, and she was trying to find other ways around it. One of the big focuses of their critiques, which has come up in some of the earlier talks, is obviously Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger's positing of being and identity as being an existential, authentic self is something that is highly problematic. And the highly problematic aspect of this for Adorno, who absolutely lambasts him, and Stein, who takes him apart, but in a much more organic and figurative way, is this idea of the Mitsein, the herd and the individual, which Heidegger basically sees as being an afterthought to individuality. However, for Adorno and for Stein, they both share this idea that that the Mitsein, the with other people, is absolutely central to our constitution of the self. This idea of being and being having a fixed, authentic identity is something that Adorno has to reject. He has to reject it out of hand. There cannot be a fixed identity. A fixed identity is an imposition and it's authoritarian. Now, Stein does not use the terminology of deconstructing power and authority, but what she does do is she posits the question, as we heard earlier, like, when you're thrown into the world, where are you thrown from? The being in the world, where's that come from? How is that constituted? And her sense of becoming is such that you cannot really say that you're at an instant a static being. There is a sense of being is actualized, and there's also a potential being as well. So therefore, there is a conduit that where being is recognized, as we said earlier from Konrad Martius. It's this actualization that happens as it crosses the fleeting moment of time where you become something, and then that can fade and die and be something else. But being locked in to some kind of an identity, and for other people to impose that identity upon you, is for Adorno seen as part of some kind of like authoritarian domination. And what he does as well is he sees that Heidegger's attempt to really seal this authentic self is a deal with the devil, really, for Adorno, and a deal with a particular devil, which of course is National Socialism, which really did try to assert its sense of German identity. It tried to assert its sense of like an Aryan race in the middle of all this, and it's not an accident that both Stein and Adorno, with their Jewish backgrounds, who were directly impacted by the Nuremberg laws and all the subsequent horrors that followed, were absolutely against this. And Heidegger, in his own failure, as a human being and as a philosopher, failed to really address this and identify it in any serious way. The conflicts and antinomies that exist within Husserl are picked up upon by Adorno, who is developing an anti-system approach. Now, Stein, from a humanistic point of view, finds that she is able to use the terminology that Adorno found so repellent in Husserl to get to a different place. And it's a very sophisticated readings that she brings. She's able to ameliorate aspects of Husserl, and also, obviously, as we know now, she's actually changed modes of his thought. So he developed as a thinker due to Stein's influence. What is key here is this relationship between idealism and materialism. And this is a really, really strong division that is happening through Europe, but it's with us to this day. The materialist idea is an idea that's grounded in experience, must be grounded in experience. And in some respects, Stein is a materialist in terms of that, in the same way that the split in terms of phenomenology did term itself realist. Now, at the other end of that is like there's a reticence with terminology here, because of the political situation in Germany, because of what was going on in terms of the to and fro and the absolute chaos of the Weimar Republic. Designation of Marxist ideas or ideas that were being seen as what Stein would regard as Bolshevism, although you might be tolerated or accepted, you didn't, in the institutes and academies, you don't be associated with them. If you were a Marxist, you just didn't get a job, the same way that if you were Jewish, you didn't get a job, or if you were a woman, you didn't get a job. These were the kind of identity politics that were at play there. Now, the Frankfurt School later on actually posited an institute that went against those kind of things, although some would say that it was still a boys' club. But however, it is addressing some issues around ethnicity and around like political designation. And we have to think about these times that where identity was really, it was something that was like really something that was like very much on everybody's tongue. How you were identified, how you saw yourself, how other people saw you, and how they identified you was actually front and center. Now, the limits of philosophy were reached in this, and actually, it's no accident that I've said that underneath you have dread, anxiety, and revelation, and that is a reference to Kierkegaard. And both Heidegger, Stein, and Adorno all saw that this limitation that philosophy as a system could only explain things up to a certain point. And for Stein, the theological response was something that gave us more. It was a beyond the self, a beyond our ability to think as just experiential, just in terms of what we experienced ourselves and what could be experienced in terms of the divine. The Heideggerian approach countered that, which was located in the self where you had to find the authentic self. But Adorno, interestingly, comes at this and admits that theology does have something that philosophy cannot give. Now, this he links back to Hegelian Marxism, where the idea is that a socialist utopia, that a socialist vision could be beyond what we know as being a philosophical system. It's something beyond that we haven't experienced yet, something that we have to take a leap of faith towards, something that fills us with dread and anxiety as we come into contact with it. And the difference between Adorno and Stein, really, from my perspective, is one of positing what is beyond the philosophical system. You posit what's beyond. For Adorno, it's like beyond philosophy is society. There are different types of society, so there are multiple philosophies, and some of them are in conflict. For Stein, it's a theological response. So it is the divine is beyond our society. The divine is beyond our systemized sense of who we are. So what we have here to finish up really is that you've got this divide between like a transcendental idealism on the one hand and the historical materialism, which is associated with Marx on the other hand. And really what you have are these thinkers that are coming into this. And as we said, the quote at the bottom from Finite and Eternal Being says it really, there's a discrepancy between what things actually essentially ought to be and what they actually are. There's a disproportion between what things could essentially become and the state that they actually attain. There's a fluidity, a fluctuating that is going on. And certainly between transcendental idealism and historical materialism, there is a fluctuating thing going on there, and there is a dialectic at work there. And some of the thinkers that we've mentioned, you can place around this. Stein herself, sort of on the fringes of the historical materialism there, and we're pretty much in the Husserl camp. Adorno, much more towards the materialism. Konrad Martius, again, with Stein over in the phenomenological camp, but again, much more heading towards the realist stuff. Benjamin actually flirts quite a lot with very strict notions of Marxism, but then in terms of his debate with Adorno, comes back the other way, and then finds a sort of Marxist mysticism as well that definitely is heading in the idealist direction. A person that's missing from a lot of this, and again, the trajectory does come through from Heidegger, but is, of course, Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt, interestingly, without getting into the debate between her and Adorno, which is a whole other area, but I just want to leave you with a concept that Hannah Arendt's connection with Gerhard Stern, who she married. Gerhard Stern was a pupil of Theodor Adorno, and Stern also was the son of William Stern, who was Edith Stein's mentor and worked with Stein as well. So there are connections within this that are sort of maybe have to be teased out more. There's a lot of work. I know Stein's work is neglected itself. Konrad Martius is obviously neglected. There are these other figures here, and I think that there's much more to this story than meets the eye. Certainly, there's a lot that has to be published yet, and that it hasn't really been researched. And I do think that this is a very interesting time. I think these thinkers are grappling with similar problems. They're coming from slightly different points of view, but it's compelling that they're all working around, a similar part of Europe at a similar time and experiencing certain things. And there's no doubt that there's crossover and there's exploration to be done here. Finally, the idea of a socially constituted identity, to pick up on what Gabriel was saying earlier, I too agree that the idea of the life power is a fundamentally exceptionally fluid and brilliant concept, and allows us to look at the idea of being as a metamorphosis, where we can look at like fluctuating polarities, where we can look at even the definitions of gender, the definitions of ethnicity, they can be looked at through this fluctuating, fluid way. We can look at it as an unsettled field of experience. What we experience now is maybe not going to be what we're going to experience in the future, and our view of what we experienced in the past might be different as well. The noise and interference of life and history come into it as well. So this gives us a really rich premise, which again accords with Adorno's call for an anti-system approach. That we have an anti-system approach that breaks open the certainty, and if we break open certainty, then that's going to give us the leeway to be able to take things further. So just on that there, I just want to end with this track if you could hear it. There you go. That's all you get.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. We have time for just one question, and the first question that is from says, any thoughts on Paulo Freire's concept of education for critical consciousness and how this relates to this thought of Stein or Adorno?
Yes, I think Paulo Freire is definitely he is definitely somebody who I think can be more related to a Steinian direction than an Adornian one. I think the difficulty with Paulo Freire from an Adornian perspective is that even in the institution of a ground up pedagogy, which is sort of instituted through through finding ways of working with people on the ground. It's the self-reflective element that becomes difficult in that for Adorno. If you're linked in at all to the machinations of the state, then that has to be revealed. And Freire does have aspects of that to come from a particular. I think it's if we were looking at something like Gramsci or somebody like that, there we'd be talking about the organic intellectual. To come from somewhere else, philanthropic though that might be, and well-intentioned, there are problems associated with that. Now, it's a very, very difficult area. Having said that, I think, again, from the point of view of the constitution of, how Paulo Freire actually, how successful he is or isn't, is dependent on not just Paulo Freire or what the academia thinks of him, but also those people on the ground and what they end up thinking about him as well. And his reputation, his thought, and how we feel about him in the future should not be left, as far as Adorno is concerned, to the factory of academia or anything else that is able to publish books and do. There's a much wider sense of that. Now, my sense of Stein is that Stein herself came to a conclusion that there was more going on than what was represented in literature, and that we do have to make those difficult decisions. What is the motivation for, even with intention? His intention and his motivation may be good, but good intentions do not necessarily mean that your actions are going to be benign. It can actually, hurt things as much as anything else, even if you're well intentioned.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so may I ask Paul to switch off his screen sharing?
Yeah.
And thanks, Paul. And we're going to have William join us now. I'm not sure, William, if you have would you like to share screen as well, or?
Yeah, I'll be planning on it.
Great, thanks.
1 second, just sure. Here we go.
Great,
Thank you.
Okay. William, are you set to go?
I am.
Okay. So it's my pleasure to welcome back William Tulius to Jaspers. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. He's from the American University in Cairo in Egypt. And the title of his paper today is Person in Community, Repentance and Historical Meaning, from an Individual to a Social Ethics in Stein's Early Phenomenological Treatises. So, William, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. As Stein's scholarship continues to advance beyond its early hermeneutical and historical concerns in the relation and impact of Stein's thought upon the currents of early phenomenological and neo-scholastic debates, new freedom is beginning to emerge to explore themes hitherto little studied, yet important for further understanding the full potency of Stein's thought and for situating her contributions against the backdrop of both current and historical philosophical concerns. And I think the last two papers are excellent examples of that. Among those important implications include Stein's contributions to philosophical efforts in wrestling with ethical life and responsibility. For the purposes of this paper, I take it for granted that Stein's philosophical corpus implicitly entails a consciously developing ethical vision, entering into conversation with ethical philosophy's major representatives, and I endeavored to develop that idea elsewhere, so that's why I have to take it for granted here. Stein's ethics, to the extent that we can speak of them, are consistently linked to developments in her philosophical anthropology and later her metaphysics. Focusing on the early phases of her philosophical career, one may notice in the elaboration of her philosophical anthropology a certain trajectory of analysis leading from inquiry concerning the constitution of the individual human being to the development of a multifaceted and multi-layered social theory into which person is always already integrated. Stein's ethics in this period, on the back of these ongoing inquiries, demonstrate a parallel transitional development from an initial focus upon the disclosure of individual, personal lines of ethical responsibility to a focus on articulating the nature of individual ethical becoming in relation to the community of others, as well as the nature of ethical becoming and responsibility of the community itself. So this paper will endeavor to explicate the development of Stein's ethics from this earlier focus, and for the purposes of time, I'll sort of condense that that introductory section to development of a social ethics of community and the state, culminating in a theory of moral solidarity, historical responsibility, and the necessary role of communal repentance of continual importance for the further development of contemporary ethical society. So just very briefly, Stein, like many phenomenologists following Brentano, will hold that the spirituality of the person is revealed especially in the value tropism of personality through feeling acts towards the world as a world imbued with axiological meaning. The personal I is constituted in the feeling of values, and in particular in the specific levels of values to which the person is open. And it's in many respects the ethical task of the person, as it seems to be displayed on the problem of empathy, to develop personality in accordance with an objective hierarchy of values, much like Max Scheler. And she uses in particular a metaphor of depth or core of the person, which uncovers itself, or we gain new layers of our personality the deeper we feel, especially the higher values. So the moral task is, in this context especially, posited as one of self-formation of the personality in response to the highest of values. Stein's conceptualization of the moral life within this initial framework is especially focused on this individual task of moral self-formation, interiorly attentive to the renovation of the architecture of the soul, as she will eventually describe it. Such a picture could initially be construed as a purely individual ethics, with nothing directly to say about the social context in which morality is lived. However, already as early as her treatise on individual and community in the latter half of her Beiträge, a further development of ethical theory emerges in tandem with and predicated upon her individual ethics of personal self-formation, which is best conceived as a social ethics of repentance and communal renewal that establishes itself as a calling of community in historical time. It is to this theme that we especially ought now to turn. Stein's social ethics emerges particularly in the development of her philosophy of community, beginning in the latter half of the Beiträge and in an investigation concerning the state. However, its development, just like the theory of community from which it emerges, grows out of her theory of the person and the nature of personal ethical responsibility. Thus, in order to lay out the framework for Stein's social ethics, a brief discussion of her theory of community and its relation to the person will be necessary. What will be crucial here is not so much how Stein develops her phenomenology of intersubjectivity, but instead how the results of that analysis present the community, the being of community, as a carrier of value, and as the stage of both individual and communal moral becoming, thus highlighting a few salient features of Stein's early moral analysis. Taking the Husserlian pure ego as her point of departure, Stein illustrates how individual streams of consciousness converge, as in the case of communal mourning. On such occasions, grief does not belong only to isolated subjects enduring sorrow atomistically cut off from one another. Rather, this grief is not mine only, but is simultaneously ours. The subject in such experiences is not a set of mere individual egos in monadic isolation, but a communal we subject, although the we of communal experiencing is neither a singular personal consciousness of its own, nor the sum total of all individual conscious streams contained within it. Although Stein will follow Husserl and Scheler in appealing to the community as a personality of a higher order, Stein also consistently maintains its limits. While possessing the structure of communal character, a communal consciousness, and even a communal network of what Stein calls vital power or Lebenskraft, community does so only insofar as its conscious life, structure of personality, etc. are all born by the individuals who carry community within themselves across time and place, and especially by those members who have a special consciousness of the community and a special responsibility for and effect upon its life. For example, the person who is the life of the party. The life of community is born in the levels of individual subjective existence, essentially permeable to shared life. Especially within historical, socio-political, military, and other attitudes, the normal orientation of interpersonal experiencing, focused upon individual persons as members and bearers of community, can be shifted to the encounter of the solidary community itself as an independent unit of meaning. Within this orientation, Stein writes, quote, "We find communities out there in life, but we find them within us as well, for we live as its members," end quote. Finding communities out there and within, in intertwining and overlapping relations, we can discern how communities live, act, feel, value, etc., as solidary unities of a higher order, in modes that are analogous to the individual personality. As a personality of a higher order, then, community, like individual persons, acquires a character, and thus also a moral sense. The structure of the relations between individuals within the community, as well as its specific acts and orientations towards the world of values, thus also take on a distinctive moral significance. Of obvious ethical importance are Stein's investigations into the significance of prevailing social attitudes for constituting the character of the community. Stein writes, "There are attitudes of the person that matter directly to another person in her individual quality and affect her to the core. Love, trust, gratitude, and so forth, and even that which we call faith in a human being," end quote. Such acts and attitudes have the effect of enlivening the person who receives them, inasmuch as there is real community among persons who are evaluatively affirmed in and through them. Drawing on Scheler, Stein observes that the opposite acts of distrust, aversion, hatred are devitalizing because in them the person is evaluatively negated. By contrast, if I find that I am not loved by a stranger with whom I share no community, that is, no common life, this fact is experienced as indifferent, although it might be otherwise if I learn that I am hated by them. Then, as in the case of enemy states, a community of life might emerge along with the mutual hostility arising in my reaction to being hated. The contrast here is telling, though, to the extent that while hatred devitalizes and negatively valorizes individuals in the communal life into which they enter, love invites persons into community in a uniquely vitalizing way, especially insofar as love is a responsiveness to values of a determinate sort, that is, the absolute value of the person as person. Although hate also constitutes community, as we have seen, and one that can even be temporarily energizing. For instance, when one nation becomes energized for a fight by the presence of an enemy state on its borders. The propellant character of hate taxes the vital powers of the community and the individual alike, requiring constant consumption of energy from the alternative sources continually to fan the flames of hatred. By contrast, for Stein, she writes, quote, love operates within the one who loves as an invigorating force that might even develop more powers within him than experiencing it costs him. And hate depletes his powers far more severely as a content than as an experiencing of hate. Thus, love and positive attitudes in general don't feed upon themselves. Rather, they are a font from which I can nourish others without impoverishing myself. End quote. The act of love is, from this perspective, then, vitally valuable for community and individual alike. By contrast, hate as a social attitude operative within and constitutive of community is a vital disvalue. Since, on Stein's account and on the problem of empathy, within the limits of possibility, positive values ought to be realized and negative values ought not to be realized, Stein's philosophy of community is structured at this stage upon a moral intuition. Communities of life constituted in love ought to be such, and those constituted in hate ought not to be. Further, the more a community is filled up by love as its characteristic orientation, the higher its value, and vice versa. Moreover, Stein argues community requires reciprocal relationships of openness between its members, so that the primordial form of communal life is more of the nature of love than of hate. Although a community of life can be constituted by hatred, such a community is intent upon its own dissolution, aiming at the negation and annihilation of the other. It thus cannot serve as archetype, but as counter-image of authentic community. Authentic community is rather constituted in the relation of love, a relation which is community constituting especially inasmuch as it orders persons towards, quote, open and naive commitment, not separated living, but common living, fed from common sources and stirred by common motives, rather than the self-closure of individual monads. We could clarify her point there. Community, in other words, loses its intelligibility in the absence of a common life grounded in shared sources of vitality and spiritual value. Furthermore, the intuition into the structuration of authentic community, according to the patterns of love that bind it, becomes informative of intra and extra-communal ethical relations of obligation. In the immediate context, Stein first indicates this in terms of the valuable enlivening functions of patriotism as a love for my political community and the willingness to sacrifice for its good, energizing the community as a political whole. Such love, then, performs a vitally valuable service for the national community, just as the hatred received becomes a vital disvalue through its effects on the communal life as such. On the other hand, blind patriotism, as in the case of Stein's Germany so tragically illustrates, is not unproblematically a moral value. Patriotism and love for one's community can drive the individual acting in the community's name to commit moral atrocities. This is why Stein highlights the important ethical role played within a community by a moral elite. Individuals who have a special consciousness of the objective order of values and of their responsibility for the development of their communal character in receptivity to values. Community may be formed with an authentic or an inauthentic receptivity for values in their objective hierarchies. The condition of the community as receptive to authentic regions of values is not a function of community as a whole, but rests in a particular way on singular personalities within it. Stein's example is the horror which the European Alps and its inhabitants had inspired in much historical literature until Rousseau, Goethe, and others first discovered their aesthetic beauty, which is today, she writes, a self-evident possession of the world of European civilization, gained for it by single personalities. Such peculiarly value-open personalities thus have an important role to play in the moral revival of the community by the world of values. Consequently, individuals such as artists, philosophers, saints, etc., serve as, quote, organs making the community capable of contact with the world of values, like the open eye with which the community peers into the world. Serving as Functionaries of community, such personalities especially furnish the discovery of the authentic and inauthentic forms of community life on the basis of rightly ordered relations of love for persons and values that is the condition not only of community, but of moral community. It is still up to the mass of the community to be receptive to the prophetic witness of its moral visionaries. Nevertheless, as Stein writes, it is important that those who possess the eyes open to the world of values be living as members of the community in live interaction with its components. Whoever locks himself up inside himself, whoever won't let the abundance of his inner life become efficacious outwardly, can't be considered an organ of the community and doesn't open up access for it, the sources from which it can be supplied with propellant powers. End quote. Ethically, whoever possesses an intuition into the right order of values and does not open themselves up to the community in the effort at its moral renewal, fails in the proper social responsibility, which is uniquely their own, and through which alone community can develop along new and higher moral lines. The permeability of the person for authentic values, however, is properly speaking the essence of moral character, as is the manner in which practical action is determined by such value insights. The character or soul of the individual person, then, and the character of the community is measured according to its openness to objective orders of values, including the absolute value of persons themselves, in their proper relations and felt according to their proper depth. The community, then, as an analog of the individual personality, is a bearer of an ethical, personal value or disvalue attaching to its members, albeit unequally, according to the degree to which one participates in the virtues or vices of communal personality as a whole. Relative to other sociological forms, including the mass, which, because it is constituted through the mechanisms of psychic contagion without genuine spiritual motivation, has no character to speak of, she insists, an association, or Gesellschaft, which as an artificial rationalization of community and subordinated to it is morally ambivalent relative to the value of its goal-oriented ends. Community proper, Gemeinschaft, possesses a distinctive value with a kind of moral primacy of its own. As Stein writes, within the essential mutuality of communal life, quote, acts turn up that don't occur in the life of a solitary soul, acts in which one subject confronts others and in which one subject turns to the other, asking, inviting, demanding, and the like, end quote. Within these acts, moreover, there are emotional attitudes that one induces in another. So, the moral evaluation and judgment of the character of a person, of her sentiments and deeds, approval, admiration, contempt, indignation, and the like. Thus, alongside the moral encounter with the other, and in my response to her moral character, as Stein had already argued in On the Problem of Empathy, my own moral life and moral character is constituted. Thus, community is the originary context in which I discover and take up the ethical task. As Stein insists, when she writes that just as there are attitudes that would be impossible in the soul living solitarily, so there are also properties that can develop only in unions of persons: humility, pride, servility and defiance, power, lust, and affability, team spirit and helpfulness, in short, all social virtues and vices. If community, in a privileged respect, is the space of moral development, as Aristotle had also recognized, then it also reflects a more than individual moral responsibility. While the moral development of the individual person is uniquely her own responsibility, since freedom of will is never suspended by communal circumstance or environment, nonetheless, community can be authentic or inauthentic, can be an inauthentic or inauthentic influence upon the development of the person, especially as stronger personalities characteristically impress their stamp upon the more impressionable. Within community, I have a responsibility for the impacts that my own doing, loving, hating, and relating have upon the development of others as it guides or shuts off their proper formation. The community as a whole also bears a responsibility, realized individually within its members, and especially those who peculiarly bear the life of the community, for example, community leaders, as well as those personalities who are functional organs of communal moral intuition, etc. The community itself is already essentially a bearer of value in its unification of individual subjective life, in, as Stein puts it, the release of the individuals from their natural loneliness, and in the new super-individual personality that unites in itself the powers and abilities of the discrete members, turns them into its own functions, and through this synthesis can produce achievements. In other words, community, synthesizing the lives of individuals into a solidary union, unleashes value productive forces or value realizing forces within the world that is itself a bearer of value. Stein insists that the value of community persists even when the community unites for morally wicked purposes, but the fact that community is endowed with the freedom for good or evil in collective action imposes a communal self-responsibility to direct its actions towards right values. Since such responsibility is not borne by the community independent of its members, the moral ideal of social and ethical life will consist, quote, in the highest mode of community, as the union of purely free persons who are united with their innermost personal life, or the life of soul, and each of whom feels for himself or herself and for the community, end quote. Such a community is especially a community of love, freely given and received and oriented around the consciousness of collective and individual responsibility for one another. However, such community, like Stein's ideal person, who's the person fully informed by all levels of value and in their proper order, serves as a regulative ideal. Actual communities will consist of a mixture of social, intentional, and structural forms, deviating in one respect or another from the ideal. Such deviations are value-laden to the extent that the ideal of community is more or less the orienting pole of their lives. Since communities, in fact, typically deviate from the ideal of community, an ideal patterned upon the forms of freedom, love and sympathy, and co-responsibility, such deviations must be navigated ethically and simultaneously offer criteria for moral evaluation of the structures and character of the community. This intuition is of greatest impact in Stein's An Investigation Concerning the State, in which she dedicates herself to her most explicit and extended interrogation of ethical concerns. It is to that work that we must finally turn in addressing the issue of political community as a major stage upon which social ethical responsibility is born, and by means of which it comes to play a primary role in the realization of ideal values in time through the cooperative development of a communal ethico-political character that, in repentance in particular, shoulders responsibility for what Stein calls history. Following from her analysis of the constitution of community in the Beiträge, Stein reaffirms her personalist starting point that community is founded in individual persons who bear a communal life within themselves. Community as a bearer of ethical value is part of what Stein and Husserl call objective spirit, a bearer of personal values which, quote, attach to the essential substance of the person and her ways of purporting herself, end quote, as well as in her inner responses to values. Even within this individual framework, though, the social dimensions of moral responsibility are especially underscored in Stein's treatment of the problem of guilt, both moral guilt or legal guilt and moral guilt or sin, as well as punishment and repentance. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of that analysis. Running alongside the concern for individual moral guilt and merit, however, Stein also recognizes the important question of the moral status of the community. Since the community is, as we have seen, not a personal actor in independence from its individual bearers, its moral status will not look the same as that of the individual person who individually bears merit and guilt. On the other hand, the moral personality of the community is subject to moral evaluation, especially in the recognition of the important distinction between a priori ethical norms and the objective order of value from which they flow, and the structure of the historically and culturally constituted prevailing morality. The prevailing morality of any given community, culture, civilization, or nation, as Stein writes, can deviate from the just so of ethics obtaining a priori. In that regard, the prevailing morality is subject to ethical evaluation of its own and may be judged to be more or less perverse to the extent that it departs in greater or lesser degrees from the a priori of ethical norms. The prevailing morality, quote, mirrors back the habitus of soul of a community of persons, its basic stance toward the world of values. And in doing so, it serves as a standard of judgment for the moral character of the community itself, that is structured by a more or less right relation to values, including those borne by the persons who constitute the community and its social environment. The community cannot readily reform itself in the order of its values, except in the souls of the individual persons who make it up. And even there, it can do so only on the basis of alternative practical behavior and renovation of structures and forms of social interaction, which will transform the morality as a whole through large-scale, earnest personal repentance, leading ideally to the ethical renewal of humanity at large. The state, through its legal apparatus, may play an important function in the transformation of morality through the institution of laws or legal regulations that alter practical comportment and thus provide a space for the alteration of the inner habitus of soul in relation to the order of values, that is, repentance. But the process of the reform of morality cannot be run by the state or legal apparatus. Rather, it must originate in the souls of those who, as the functionaries of the community, are capable of intuiting the right order of values and the a priori of ethical norms, that is, social reformers of all stripes, philosophers, activists, priests, politicians, etc. Nonetheless, the state can and perhaps ought to be utilized as a specific tool of social moral reformation and repentance by combating the prevailing morality through legal regulation, as well as through the development of institutions facilitating proper moral development. In regard to the latter, Stein might especially highlight the functions of schools and churches, although it is equally plausible that such institutions could become functional roadblocks to moral reformation as well, and thus might themselves require state interventions ordered towards their own reform as functionaries of communal ethical development. Nonetheless, even in the face of such legitimate political and social efforts at taking command of the moral life of the community, interventions in regard to the prevailing morality cannot legitimately pursue their ends through coercion, as repentance ultimately is a matter of personal freedom and not of external force. This applies to the individual as well as to foreign communities. Thus, freedom is a central pillar of ethical political community as such, at least envisioned by Stein. Finally, Stein is concerned to articulate the dimensions of communal morality in terms of historical process. This is not a disconnected issue for Stein, but arises in connection with the problems of moral value in society. Taking issue with Hegel's reduction of the meaning of history to the process of the coming to consciousness of freedom with the emergence of the liberal state, Stein nonetheless holds that history must be understood as a process of spiritual development. However, what is developing is, as she says, not freedom, but its carrier, the individual person or the community of persons. Moreover, history is not merely the process of the development of free communities of persons, as though the triumph of the liberal state constitutes the end of history, as Fukuyama has famously or infamously argued, but is rather the process of the realization of concrete values. Such development is no narrative of inevitable progress, but is subject to movements of evolution and devolution, progress and regress, etc. However, inasmuch as development toward morality, as she writes, would not mean just awakening to freedom, but training of susceptibility for values, the content of history turns out to be the creation of culture, and a moral culture in particular. The struggle for a moral culture, then, is a historical struggle and takes on a historical significance. Here, moreover, inner moral acts of value, intuition, affirmation, repentance, etc., as well as individual moral acts of participation in or struggle against the life of the historically situated community of personal and social interventions into the moral development of persons, the moral structures of the community as open to or closed off from values, and other persons as bearers of value, and finally efforts at intervention into the development of the prevailing morality all bear a new significance here, to the extent that they take on responsibility for the sense of history, as Stein writes, the realization of values. In spite of the fact, just to conclude, in spite of the fact that Stein does not explicitly frame her phenomenological investigations as studies of ethical life, ethical concern is deeply and thematically woven into the fabric of her studies of anthropology, community, and political existence. Thus, I have attempted to chart the development of Stein's early ethical thought as it expands from an initial focus upon disclosing the ethical project as the proper unfolding of the individual person to be... Sorry? Okay. Thus, I have attempted to chart the development of Stein's early ethical thought as it expands from an initial focus upon disclosing the ethical project as the proper unfolding of the individual person to the elaboration of the social dimensions of moral life and the ethically correct structuration of community, the ethical obligations arising in and with community, and the sense of communal responsibility for carrying out the meaning of history through the constitution of a moral culture in personal repentance and social responsibility for communal renewal. Stein's individual ethics consist largely in articulating the moral task in terms of the reorganization of the patterns of depth and periphery in the feeling of values and attuning them to their objective order. And this is something that occurs both in the individual now and also in the community, and is felt as a communal responsibility for shouldering the burden of history. Thank you.
Thanks, William. We have to seed the room at 1 o'clock, so we have time for I think one question. That was a great paper, very rich, very detailed. So we end the question and answer. So Maria Pringle, thank you, William. Do you see the influence of Stein's material perspective in her understanding of community? I recall a mention of communion and empathy as origin of community, community being an organic development beginning with personal communion, the dual of being persons with male and female complementing each one another, which extends to others, of course, fostering care and love by nurturing value.
Yeah, thank you. So this is an interesting question, and I think that, in many respects, the development of Stein's thought on community predates that specific concern for questions revolving around gender and the complementarity of the sexes. But I think that in many respects, what Stein is doing here certainly is running in the background of that later conversation that she embarks upon in the context of her lectures on education and women's education, in particular within the context of Christian theology of creation. Now, in terms of sort of development of a particularly maternal aspect or something that focuses more upon caring and empathy, I'm not sure if, at least at the point that she's writing on the problem of empathy through the investigation concerning the state, I'm not sure that she would necessarily frame it in those terms, as though empathy or the constitution of communities through love would have something to do with a more maternal orientation as opposed to something else. That being said, I think that there certainly is a kind of intuition on Stein's part and a contention that she's making here that pushes back against more sort of traditional liberal notions of political community as sort of founded upon an individual, which we think of in Lockean terms as sort of the radical individual cut off from community except through something like a contract, a social contract that we're obtaining our rights in that context and sort of framing government as the protection of individual rights. I don't think that that's the image of community that she has, or political community that she has in mind. And it's one that's much more organic in character, and one also that always conceives of the individual as in relation to another. So that image of complementarity, I think it grows out of this sort of earlier development, and certainly that later development has something to say meaningfully about what she's doing at this stage in her thought.
Thank you. Anna Maria Petzela just has a concluding comment, and she writes, I think that the relationship between single individual and community is very interesting in the Beiträge. The singular individual cannot dissolve into the community, but she or he remains always a single person within his or her life. There's an individuality there, and he or she lives with his or her individuality into or within the community and so on. So she talks about, Anna Maria stresses the role of the preservation of singularity while being in community. I don't know if you have a
Certainly.
closing comment, William, that you would like to say.
Certainly, yeah, and I think that's precisely why Stein's insistence is that even if we're going to conceive of something like a communal responsibility, a communal moral responsibility, that responsibility both pertains to the community, but is borne by the individual within the community, because community does not exist apart from the individuals who bear its life and participate in it with one another. So I think that's certainly an important point that Stein is always very insistent upon throughout the Beiträge, as well as in her investigation concerning the state.
Thanks very much, William. We've come to the end of this session, so my thanks to all the speakers, to all the participants, and of course to our hosts here in Mexico. We really, really thank you for all that you've been doing and continue to do for us. And so I believe we have more.